Welcome, dear friend, to a quieter journey through the American Revolution. Not the storm of muskets or the roar of cannons, but the soft side of history. The waiting, the letters, the fan houses and fields. The quiet pauses between the battles. For while history often remembers the thunder of war, there is another side, one that moves at the pace of footsteps across meadows, or ink slowly drying on parchment. Tonight, we will drift gently through those forgotten details, the quieter side of the American Revolution. Before we begin this story, dear friend, let me know where you are listening from. I am from the north, from one of the quiet towns of America. Perhaps you may be able to guess after you listen to this story. But now, lie down, be comfortable, and let me take you through the quieter side of the American Revolution. Chapter 1: A Quiet Colony Life. Before the revolution rose in fire and thunder, there was a quieter America. The colonies, stretching along the Atlantic coast, lived not in the rhythms of battle, but in the soft patterns of daily life. In the mornings, before the sun had risen fully above the horizon, farmers would stir from their beds. The air would still be cool, sometimes damp with dew, and the fields outside their windows would shimmer faintly in the pale light. Hens clucked softly in their coops. A dog stretched lazily by the doorway. Children, still wrapped in sleep, might murmur as their mothers stirred the hearth and began to prepare a simple breakfast, bread perhaps, warmed on the iron, or porridge bubbling slowly in a pot. Life moved gently then, as it often does in times when the world is not yet in upheaval. Days were shaped not by the clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun, and by the quiet needs of farm and family. Let us linger here for a moment. Picture a small wooden farmhouse, its timbers weathered by years of wind and rain. The roof is steep and a chimney leans slightly, releasing the faintest trace of smoke into the dawn sky. Inside, a family gathers. The father pulls on rough homespun clothes, heavy with the smell of wool. The mother, already busy at the fire, hums softly as she stirs. The children, sleepy-eyed, stretch and shuffle toward the table. Outside, the fields wait. Rows of corn stand tall, their leaves rustling faintly in the morning breeze. Wheat bends low, heavy with grain. An ox, slow and patient, shifts its weight in the barn, ready for the day's work. There is no hurry. The day is long and the tasks are steady. The plow will cut through the soil. The seeds will be tended, the fences mended. And all of it moves at a pace as old as time itself. In towns, the mornings begin differently. Along cobblestone streets, shutters creak open one by one. Shopkeepers sweep their doorsteps, the soft scrape of broom bristles mixing with the distant sound of church bells. The bells do not ring an alarm, but in rhythm marking time, calling gently to the day. The marketplace fills slowly. A cart rattles by, pulled by a horse whose hooves clop against the stone. Barrels are rolled into place. A boy calls out with fresh apples, their skins shining red. Another offers bread, still warm from the oven, the scent drifting sweetly into the air. Conversations are soft, practical, unhurried. Neighbors greet one another, pausing to exchange words about the weather, the harvest, the latest shipment of goods from Boston or Philadelphia. There is no rush here either. Life is measured, even in the busier towns, by the slow unfolding of each hour. And when evening comes, the world slows further still. In farmhouses, the day's work is set aside. Families gather by the fire. A candle flickers on the table. Perhaps a Bible is opened and read aloud, the words carrying softly into the night. Outside, the crickets begin their song, steady and soothing. In towns, taverns glow with candlelight. Through the open door, laughter drifts into the cool air. Men gather around wooden tables, tankards in hand. They speak not with thunder, but with the slow rhythm of men accustomed to debate. Voices rise and fall, but rarely in anger. They talk of taxes, of ships, of governors and assemblies. But always, the talk is grounded in the ordinary, how it affects the land they till, the shops they keep, the homes they return to. And beyond it all, the night spreads wide and still. The stars above shine as they always have, untroubled by the quarrels of men. The wind moves softly through trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then is silent again. This is the America that existed before the revolution stirred. A land of farms and fields, of towns and taverns, of ordinary rhythms. A land where each day unfolded slowly, and where the loudest sound was often the creak of a wagon wheel or the gentle ring of a bell. It is in these quiet details that the revolution truly began. Not in battles, not in decorations, but in the simple lives of people, men and women who rose with the sun, worked with steady hands, and ended their days in candlelight. So let us rest here, for a moment longer in that quiet colony life. Picture it once more, a farmer guiding his plough, the ox moving slowly before him, a mother lifting bread from the fire, steam rising in the cool morning air, a shopkeeper sweeping the stone outside his door, pausing to nod at a passerby, a child sitting near a window, watching the sunlight creep across the wooden floor. This was the world before the storm. And though history would soon rush forward into musket fire and cannon smoke, there is something lasting, something grounding, in remembering the slower side, the soft beginnings, the sleepy corners of colonial life. It is here that we begin our journey, gently, quietly, at the very edge of a revolution. Chapter 2: Letters and Ink. Before battles thundered across the land, the revolution began quietly. In ink, not in fields of smoke and fire, but on folded paper, carried by hand from one town to another. It began in letters between friends, in pamphlets sold for a few pennies, in notices nailed to tavern doors. The pen scratched before the musket roared, and in that scratching, gentle, deliberate, thoughtful, we find another sleepy side of the American Revolution. Let us linger here for a moment. Picture a wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of use. A single candle flickers beside an inkwell, casting soft shadows across the room. Outside the window, the streets are quiet, cobblestones damp from an evening rain. A man, perhaps a printer, perhaps a farmer's son turned writer leans forward. He dips the quill into ink, then carefully, slowly, pulls the feather tip across the page. Each word takes shape in a hand both practiced and patient. The scratching sound is steady, like the whisper of a cricket. Stop, dip, scratch, pause, dip again. And so the letter grows. It may be a simple message, written to a cousin in another town. The harvest this year is fair. The talk in the tavern grows louder. There is word of new taxes. It may be longer, an essay in miniature. The writer's thoughts on liberty, on governors, on distant kings who seem both powerful and far away. Whatever the subject, the act is the same. Quiet, steady, sleepy almost. A revolution in thought before it is in action. And now, picture the journey of that letter. It is folded carefully, sealed with wax, slipped into the pocket of a rider. The rider mounts his horse, the leather saddle creaking softly in the night. Hoofs begin to strike the earth, not in haste, but in steady rhythm. The letter moves mile by mile, the sound of hooves like a heartbeat. In the next town, it is delivered. Perhaps it is read by lamplight in a tavern. Perhaps it is carried upstairs, where a family gathers around the table. The words are read aloud, slowly, with pauses between sentences as the listeners nod and murmur. The ink on the page carries ideas farther than the voice could ever travel. And in this way, the colonies are stitched together by quiet threads of words. In print shops, the scene is different but no less soothing. Imagine a low-ceilinged room, filled with the smell of ink and warm paper. Wooden presses creak as the printer's apprentice pulls the heavy handle. The press groans, the page lifts, and a new sheet is set aside to dry. Pamphlets stack one upon another, pages filled with neat black type. Some pamphlets speak of Parliament and protest. Others are more practical announcements of auctions, notices of ships arriving, poems written to amuse neighbours. Yet slowly, over months and years, the words of protest grow stronger. Liberty, rights, independence. These words, once whispers, now appear more often on the page. Still, even here, the pace is gentle. Printers set each letter by hand, one piece of metal for each mark of punctuation, each small word. Line by line, page by page, a pamphlet takes form. Hours for a single sheet, days for a small book. The presses do not roar. They sigh. They creak. They move with the rhythm of patience. Letters and pamphlets drift through the colonies like falling leaves. Some are tucked into coat pockets. Some are shared across tavern tables. Some are pinned to the beams of barns where neighbours gather to read them aloud. And always, the words spread slowly, quietly, carried by riders and ships, by merchants and ministers. It is easy to forget, looking back, how long news once took to travel. A letter from Boston might reach Philadelphia in a week, perhaps more if rain turned the roads to mud. A pamphlet printed in Virginia might take months to be known in New York, and yet, this slowness gave the words a kind of weight. Each letter, read aloud, became an event. Each pamphlet passed from hand to hand was treasured, folded, smoothed, kept by the firelight. Even silence was part of it. Between the reading of a sentence and the speaking of the next, listeners sat in thought. Pauses stretched long, broken only by the crackle of a hearth or the creak of a chair. In these pauses, ideas sank deep. Sometimes, a letter carried more than words. Inside its folds might be a pressed flower, sent from one garden to another, or a ribbon, a token of friendship, or even a recipe, written out in looping script, shared between households. Revolution was not all fiery declarations. It was also these softer exchanges, the reminders of family, of community, of daily life. The letters, warm with ink, carried not just politics, but the heartbeat of the people. And so, before muskets fired, the revolution lived in the ink that flowed across pages. Quiet, steady, patient. It is easy to think of history as sudden and loud, but if we listen carefully, there is another rhythm. The scratch of a quill, the sigh of a press, the hoofbeats of a horse at midnight, carrying folded paper across darkened fields. This was the sleepy side of the American Revolution, the world of letters and ink. Let us picture it one more time before we move on. A candle burns low, wax dripping silently. A quill scratches across the page. A letter is folded, sealed with wax, and slipped into the hands of a rider. The rider sets out into the night, hooves steady against the earth. And far away, in another town, a family waits for news, gathered by the hearth, listening to words carried by ink. Slowly, softly, the revolution spreads, not with thunder, but with the quiet hush of letters. Chapter 3. Taverns and tea tables. Not all battles are fought with weapons. Some are fought with words, and sometimes those words are shared over mugs of ale or cups of tea. Before the revolution became a storm, its ideas were stirred slowly, like sugar in a teacup, like foam rising gently on beer. In taverns and tea tables across the colonies, men and women gathered, not in haste, but in the natural rhythm of conversation. And in those quiet gatherings, the revolution found its voice. Let us step inside. Picture a tavern on a cool evening. The wooden sign outside creaks gently in the wind, painted with a faded image of a lion, or perhaps a ship. Through the open door, Light spills onto the dirt road. Inside, the air is warm. The smell of roasted meat mingles with the yeasty scent of ale. Tankards clink softly. Boots shuffle across creaking floorboards. Men in rough coats and tricorn hats sit at long tables, their voices weaving in steady patterns. It is not loud, not in the way of battlefields, but alive with the murmur of talk. One man leans forward, speaking of taxes. Another replies with a shake of his head. A third, quieter, listens as the foam slips down the side of his mug. At the back, a fiddler plays a slow tune, his bow sliding gently across strings. The music does not interrupt the talk. It accompanies it, like the heartbeat of the room. And outside, the night deepens, while inside, the revolution takes shape not in shouts, but in shared words. In towns and cities, taverns were the meeting houses of the people. They were places where news arrived, carried by riders or ships, and where that news was passed from ear to ear. A man might enter, shaking off the dust of the road, and place a letter on the table. Soon it would be unfolded, read aloud by firelight, and discussed in slow tones. In this way, ideas spread, not through speeches alone, but through the gentle act of conversation. Neighbors leaning closer, mugs warm in their hands, listening, questioning, wondering what it might mean for them. Taverns were not only places of talk, they were places of comfort. A traveler could find food, a bed and companionship. A farmer could trade a few coins for ale and a night of company after weeks of labor in fields. And always, at the center of it, there was talk that would one day ripple outward into action. But while taverns hummed with energy, tea tables offered another kind of rhythm. Let us step now into a quieter room. The parlor of a colonial home, its windows shuttered against the wind. A small fire glows in the hearth. On the table, delicate porcelain cups rest beside a teapot, steam rising in soft curls. Here, women gather, mothers, daughters, neighbors. Their talk is gentler, their movements slower. A spoon stirs. A hand passes a plate of bread. Laughter rises softly, then fades. The talk may turn to children, to crops, to the arrival of a new shipment of cloth. But just as in the taverns, news of parliament, taxes, and distant kings finds its way into the conversation. These tea tables, calm and domestic, were no less important to the revolution. They were places where ideas were digested as slowly as the tea itself, sipped, considered, and shared. When boycotts were called, it was here that decisions were made. Shall we drink no more tea from Britain? Shall we use linen woven at home, instead of cloth shipped across the sea? The choices made at these tables carried the revolution forward, not with muskets, but with quiet resolve. The clink of a teacup was as much a note in the symphony of change as the roll of a drum. Picture these two worlds side by side. In one, the tavern, voices rising, mugs lifted, the hum of music in the air. In the other, the parlor, cups placed gently on saucers, laughter like a soft bell. Both are slow, both are steady, both are part of the revolution's sleepy beginning. And what is remarkable is not the noise, but the patience. Words passed slowly, ideas lingered. A single pamphlet might be read aloud many times in many rooms, until even those who could not read came to know its contents by heart. The tavern keeper, pouring ale, became as much a messenger of change as the writer in his study. The woman at her tea table, deciding to forego imported goods, became as important as the soldier who would one day march with musket in hand. And yet, for all their importance, these scenes were ordinary, gentle, human. No cannon thundered in these places. No armies clashed. Only voices, moving like streams, weaving together into rivers of thought. So let us rest here in these spaces of quiet conversation. The tavern, warm with fire and ale. The tea table, glowing in the light of a single candle. Both alive with words, but never hurried. both shaping a revolution, not in bursts, but in steady murmurs. And as we picture them, let us remember that history is not always loud. Sometimes it is shared in whispers across a table, with hands wrapped around a mug and a candle burning low into the night. Let us picture it once more. Tankards lifted, foam spilling softly over the rim. A letter read aloud, the fire crackling beneath the words. A teacup raised, steam curling upward, dissolving into the quiet air. This was the quiet, sleepy side of the American Revolution. The taverns and tea tables, where talk carried the weight of change. Slowly, gently, endlessly. Chapter 4. Campfires before the storm. Long before muskets cracked and cannons roared, there were campfires. In the months before the first shots of the revolution, militiamen gathered quietly in fields, in barns, in open meadows where the grass was still damp with dew. There was no thunder yet, only the soft murmur of preparation, the scrape of flint against steel, the shuffle of boots across frosted ground, the hushed talk of neighbors who had become soldiers almost by accident. It was, in its own way, a sleepy, quiet prelude to war. Let us linger here for a moment. Picture a meadow at twilight. The sun has dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in streaks of pink and grey. Small fires are lit, their smoke curling gently upward, caught by the evening breeze. Around these fires sit men in simple coats, some wearing old hunting gear, others wrapped in cloaks against the chill. Their muskets rest beside them, leaning against stumps or laid carefully on the ground. The flames crackle softly. Sparks rise, drift, and vanish into the night. Someone stirs a pot hung over the fire, the steam carrying the faint smell of stew. Another man leans back on his pack, humming a slow tune under his breath. There is no battle here, not yet. Only the stillness of men waiting, preparing, unaware of the storms to come. The campfire is their hearth now. Its light is softer than the moon, and its warmth carries them through the cool night. By day, their tasks are simple, steady, and often slow. In the morning, muskets are cleaned. The long barrels are rubbed carefully with oiled cloth, the locks checked, the powder horns inspected. Some men practice their aim, firing not at enemies, but at wooden posts or the trunks of trees. Others drill together, though few of them are soldiers by trade. They are farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, men who know the weight of an axe or plough far better than that of a musket. The drill sergeant calls out, his voice even, never harsh. Form line, step forward. Ready arms, boots shuffle, muskets rise. The line is uneven, the timing imperfect, but the rhythm improves with each day. It is not the pace of war, it is the pace of practice. Calm, repetitive, almost like a ritual. And when the sun rises higher, the men rest. Some lie in the grass, their hats over their faces. Others carve wood with their knives, small tokens to pass the time. A few sit in groups, sharing stories of their farms, their families, the fields waiting for their return. At night, the world grows even quieter. The campfire glow becomes the heart of the gathering. Shadows stretch long across the meadow. Beyond the circle of light, the forest looms dark and deep, filled with the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Some men write letters by firelight, quills scratching on paper, balanced against their knees. Others smoke pipes, the embers glowing red in the darkness. A fiddler, if one is among them, plays a slow tune that drifts into the trees. Laughter rises softly from one circle, then fades. In another, men speak in hushed tones about what might come, though always with the quiet resignation of those who know that tomorrow is uncertain. Eventually the voices fade. Blankets are pulled tight. One by one, the men fall asleep, the fire burning lower, the stars wheeling silently overhead. It is in these hours, when all is still, that the revolution seems far away, just a rumor carried by letters and riders. For now, there is only the campfire, the earth, and the steady breath of sleeping men. Campfires were more than light. They were comfort. The fire meant warmth on a cold night, food in an empty stomach, safety in the dark. It drew men together, reminding them that they were not alone. And it gave rhythm to the days of waiting. Mornings meant drills. Afternoons meant chores, cutting wood, fetching water, mending boots. Evenings meant fire, talk, and rest. It was not glorious. It was not dramatic, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, men found strength. Let us picture it once more. The meadow at twilight, fires glowing like stars on the ground. Men gathered close, their faces lit with orange light. A pot of stew bubbling slowly, its steam rising into the cool night. Muskets leaning nearby, silent for now. And above it all, the endless sky, clear and calm, holding the quiet of the world in place. This was the quiet, sleepy side of the revolution, before battles, before declarations. The side of campfires, of patience, of men who waited in silence, not yet knowing the storm they would one day face. Chapter 5. The Slow March of Armies. Battles are often remembered for their noise, the thunder of cannons, the clash of muskets. But most of war is not battle. It is marching. Step after step, mile after mile, under sun, under rain, across fields and rivers. For the soldiers of the revolution, the march was their constant companion. And though history remembers the great moments of glory and defeat, the sleepy side of the revolution is found in these slower journeys, where armies moved like rivers across the land. Let us walk with them for a moment. Picture a dirt road, stretching into the distance. On either side, fields ripple in the breeze, or woods stand silent and green. The road itself is worn with ruts, filled with puddles after rain. Along it, an endless line of men moves forward, step by step, boots thudding softly on the packed earth. The pace is slow, the rhythm steady. A drum taps somewhere in the column, not sharply, but lazily, marking time. Each man carries his musket, his pack, his blanket rolled tight. The straps rub against shoulders. The sun beats down, and still the line moves on. There is no shouting here, no drama, only the sigh of men walking, the creak of leather, the occasional cough. This was the march, the long, quiet heart of war. Sometimes the march carried them through towns. Children watched from doorways as the soldiers passed by, their coats dusty, their hats pulled low. A woman might hand a jug of water to a weary man at the roadside. Dogs barked, then fell silent again. Other times, the march stretched across empty countryside. Fields swayed golden in the sun. Streams trickled softly beneath wooden bridges. The soldiers moved in silence, each man lost in his thoughts, counting the miles ahead or thinking of home. And at night, the column halted. Fires were lit in fields or forests. Bread was shared. Water boiled for coffee or thin stew. And then, just as quietly, the men stretched out on the ground, their cloaks pulled around them, falling asleep beneath the stars. The march filled their days, the camp their nights, a rhythm that repeated itself over and over, slower than battle, but far more constant. Imagine the view from the rear of the column. Ahead, the line stretches endlessly, muskets glinting faintly in the light. Wagons creak forward, pulled by oxen or horses. Barrels of powder rattle. Wheels squeal against the weight. Officers ride slowly along the flanks, their horses stepping carefully to avoid the ruts. Their words are few. A nod here, a gesture there, keeping the line steady. Behind the wagons, more men walk, and behind them, the dust of the road rises, drifting into the air, marking the army's passage like a faint trail across the land. The march is not hurried. It is patient. It is steady. It is endless. There are moments of small comfort along the way. A stream to drink from, cool and clear. A farmhouse where a kind family offers bread. A patch of shade beneath a tall oak, where the men rest for a moment, boots unlaced, feet cooled in the grass. Then the drum begins again, and the line stirs. Boots are pulled back on, muskets lifted. The march resumes. The men do not complain loudly. Their voices are low, murmurs drifting along the road. One sings softly, and others hum along. Another tells a story, half to himself, half to his neighbor. Laughter rises faintly, then fades, carried away by the steady rhythm of feet. This is the war most often forgotten, the war of footsteps. Even when battles were expected, the march came first. Soldiers might walk for days toward a place they had never seen, carrying only rumors of an enemy ahead. And often, when they arrived, the enemy had gone, or the battle never came. So they marched again. New roads, new rivers, new fields. Always forward, though often without knowing why. It was in these marshes that the revolution grew, not in noise, but in patience. Men learned to endure. They learned to walk together, thousands of steps in the same rhythm, bound not by glory, but by the quiet persistence of the road. Let us picture it once more. The road stretching endlessly across the land, boots striking softly against the earth, the creak of wagons, the groan of leather straps, a drum tapping faintly, steady as a heartbeat, and above it all, the wide sky watching silently as men moved slowly beneath it. This was the sleepy side of the revolution, not in its battles, but in its marshes. Not in sudden noise, but in the slow, steady rhythm of footsteps carrying men into the unknown. Chapter 6. Letters from the Front. Even in war, words traveled more often than weapons. For soldiers in the revolution, the truest connection to home was not the sound of drums or the call of officers, but the quiet act of writing. A letter, folded neatly, sealed with wax, carried across miles of muddy roads, across rivers and hills. This was the thread that tied men at the front to the families waiting behind. The revolution, before it was history, was a story told in ink. Let us sit beside one of those soldiers now. It is evening in camp. The day's march is over. The drill's done. The fire's burning low. Around him, men talk softly. Some sleep already. Others mend their boots or sharpen knives. But he sits a little apart, his musket laid aside, a small scrap of paper resting on his knee. A candle stub flickers beside him, its light soft and wavering in the night air. He dips his quill into ink, pauses, and begins to write. My dearest, the letter may begin. The march has been long, but my health is fair. The nights are cold, but we keep warm by the fire. I think of you often, and I pray this war may end soon. The words are plain, almost ordinary, yet each one carries a world of feeling, the weight of longing, of memory, of hope. The quill scratches softly, the candle burns lower, and sentence by sentence the soldier carries himself home. These letters were not written quickly. Paper was precious. Ink was scarce. Each page was filled with care. The lines crowded, the handwriting small, to save space. And yet, even with such care, the words were simple. Soldiers spoke of weather, of food, of the friends beside them. They spoke of the land that they marched through, fields of corn, forests of pine, rivers that glimmered beneath the sun. Above all, they spoke of love, of wives and children, of parents and siblings, of home. For what is war to the ones who fight it, but a longing for the life they left behind? Each letter was a bridge between two worlds, the world of muskets and marshes, and the world of hearths and kitchens, where children played and fields lay waiting for seed. Now picture the journey of such a letter. It is folded carefully, tied with twine, and placed in the hands of a courier. The courier mounts his horse at dawn, the saddle creaking, the animal's breath rising in the cool air. He rides slowly at first, then steadily, mile after mile. Hooves strike the earth in rhythm, carrying the words across hills and valleys, through rain and sun. Sometimes the journey takes days, sometimes weeks. Roads are muddy, bridges washed out, rivers swollen. Yet still, the letter moves on. And finally, it reaches a village, a town, a farmhouse waiting. A knock at the door, a folded page placed into waiting hands. And at last, the words, written by firelight, are read aloud by firelight again. Imagine the scene. A mother sits at the table, her children gathered close. She smooths the page gently, as though it were a fragile thing. Her eyes move slowly across the lines, her lips shaping each word. My health is fair. I think of you often. I pray this war may end soon. The children listen. One smiles, another holds back tears. The words are simple, yet they carry the presence of the absent father, the faraway husband, the son who will not return home until the war is done. And when the letter is finished, it is folded again, placed carefully in a box or drawer, to be read once more on another night when the fire burns low. In this way, letters became treasures more valuable than coin, more cherished than food, for in them lived the voices of those far away. Not all letters carried good news. Some brought word of illness. Some spoke of hardship, the cold of camp, the lack of food, the endless marshes. And some carried grief. A commander's letter, written with heavy hand, telling a mother her son had fallen. These letters too were read by firelight, the ink blurring as tears fell upon the page. But even then, there was a strange comfort in words. To know, at last, what had become of the absent. To feel, even through sorrow, that connection of voice and pen. The revolution was a war, yes, but it was also a correspondence, a slow, steady exchange of words across a land divided by distance and time. Let us picture it once more. A soldier bent over his paper, quills scratching slowly. A courier riding along muddy roads, the letter tucked safe in his coat. A family at home, gathered close by the hearth, hearing the words read aloud. And finally, the letter folded once more, kept safe as a reminder of presence and absence. This was the sleepy side of the revolution. Not thunder, not fire, but ink on paper. Not generals, but families. Not battles, but words. And in those words, a war lived quietly, between the lines, across the miles, carried by letters from the front. Chapter 7. Winter encampments. History often remembers the battles, the sudden thunder of muskets, the clash of bayonets, the cries across the field. But for soldiers of the revolution, the greater part of war was not fought in fire, but in waiting. And nowhere was this more true than in winter encampments. For when the snow fell and the roads turned to ice, and the fields lay frozen and silent, the armies of both sides grew still. They could not march. They could not fight. They could only endure. And so, we turn now, dear friend, to those long, quiet winters, to the sound of snow against canvas, the crackle of a fire in the cold, and the slow rhythm of men waiting for spring. Imagine it is December in Pennsylvania in 1777. The land lies white beneath a heavy sky. The forests are bare, their branches dark against the snow. Smoke curls slowly upward from the chimneys of small farmhouses. And beyond, in the hills, an army gathers. Valley Forge, a place whose name has become a symbol of endurance. Here, thousands of men raised their tents and built wooden huts, hammering logs together while the cold bit at their fingers. Their boots wore thin, their coats frayed, yet still they worked. shaping shelters from the trees around them. By nightfall, the hills glowed faintly with firelight, each spark a sign of men gathered close, warming their hands, speaking softly, waiting for dawn. This was not the noise of battle. This was the hush of survival. In the mornings, the camp stirred slowly. Soldiers rose stiff from their blankets, their breath white in the air. The fires had burned low in the night, and men hurried to stoke them again, feeding them with scraps of wood. Breakfast was plain, hardtack perhaps, or thin porridge. Sometimes there was little to eat at all. Afterwards, men drilled in the snow, muskets on their shoulders, boots crunching in rhythm. For even in stillness, the army had to keep its order. Officers called commands, voices carrying across the frosted air. Then came the long hours of the day. Some mended their clothes, stitching patches into worn coats. Some chopped wood, their axes echoing through the camp. Others sat in circles, talking softly, playing simple games with dice or cards. And always the fire. Always the need to gather close to warmth. Yet winter was no gentle guest. The cold was sharp, biting through thin coats. Snow found its way into tents, dampening blankets. Boots wore through, and men walked barefoot on frozen ground, their feet wrapped in rags. Illness spread quickly, fever, coughs, and the weakness that comes when food is scarce. And yet the camp endured. Each man helped the next. A sick comrade was covered with an extra blanket. A piece of bread was shared. A pot of soup was stretched as far as it could go. What held the soldiers together was not just duty, but a quiet fellowship forged in the hardest days of the year. In winter, time itself seemed to slow. Days passed with little change. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. The fires burned low, were fed, and flared once more. Letters came rarely, bringing news from home. Men carved small trinkets from wood, whittling by the fire. They wrote in journals, noting the cold, the hunger, the endless waiting. At night, the camp grew quiet. Fires glowed dimly in the darkness, their smoke rising into the star-filled sky. The sound of footsteps on snow softened, and the camp settled into stillness. It was in these nights, when nothing moved but the wind, that soldiers dreamed most often of home, of fields green with spring, of the smell of bread baking, of the sound of children's laughter. Dreams in winter were a kind of sustenance, and so winter encampments remind us of a truth often forgotten, that wars are not only fought in moments of thunder, but in seasons of silence, that men can endure not just battle, but cold and hunger, and find strength in one another. Valley Forge, Morristown, the nameless, winter camps scattered across the land, each one was a place where war slowed, where life was pared down to its simplest rhythms. Fire, food, friendship, and waiting for spring. It was not glorious. It was not swift. But it was here, in the cold, that endurance was forged. And perhaps, as you picture those huts standing in the snow, smoke rising gently into the grey sky, you may feel the hush of that winter for yourself. A silence broken only by the crackle of fire, the soft murmur of men speaking in the night, and the steady, endless falling of snow. Chapter 8. The Sea and the Shore. When we think of the American Revolution, our minds often turn to battles fought on fields, among forests and farms. But another part of the struggle lay far from land, out upon the water. The sea, eternal and restless, carried ships of war and trade. It brought supplies, soldiers, and news. And it became another place where the revolution unfolded. Let us drift now to the harbors, the rivers, and the open waters, where sails rose in the wind, and men kept long watches upon the sea. Imagine a harbor in 1776. The morning mist clings to the water. Fishing boats bob gently, their nets drying in the early light. Beyond them, larger vessels rest at anchor, merchant ships, their masts tall against the sky. On the shore, warehouses stand silent, their doors closed, while a few figures move slowly along the docks. A sailor coils rope. A boy carries a bucket of fresh water. The sea has always had its rhythm, and even in times of war, it remains steady. Tides rise and fall, gulls circle overhead, and ships sway gently in the current. But beneath the calm, there is tension, for harbors could shelter trade or invasion, life aboard a ship. Step now aboard a vessel of the Continental Navy. The deck is narrow, the wood worn smooth by countless footsteps. Sails strain gently in the wind above, their ropes creaking like an old door. Life at sea is not a life of drama, but of repetition. The day begins with the changing of the watch, one crew taking their rest, another stepping into duty. Some climb the rigging, moving nimbly among ropes and sails. Others scrub the deck with seawater, keeping it clean of salt and grit. A cook tends to a small galley where the smell of boiled salt pork drifts in the air. At noon, a bell rings, marking the slow passage of time. A sailor pulls out a fiddle, playing a tune to pass the hours. Another sharpens a blade, another mends a torn sleeve. And all the while, the sea moves endlessly beneath the keel, carrying the ship wherever the wind allows. Crossing the ocean was no quick task. Weeks, sometimes months, passed before a destination was reached. Sailors watched the horizon each day, scanning for the faint outline of land or for the distant sails of another ship. Some days, the sea lay calm and blue, like glass stretching to the horizon. Other days, storms rose suddenly, waves battering the deck, the wind shrieking through the rigging. But even the storms passed, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of waves and the quiet waiting of men aboard. There were, at times, clashes upon the water. Ships fired cannons across the waves, their smoke drifting into the wind. Sailors rushed to load and fire again, their voices shouting above the roar. Yet these battles were rare, and often short. More common were the long, quiet days of watching, waiting, and keeping to the endless routines of the sea. And so, while history remembers names like John Paul Jones and famous encounters upon the water, for most sailors, the revolution at sea was not marked by cannon fire, but by patience, the shoreline and the rivers. Along the coasts and rivers too, the war was felt. Villagers watched as ships sailed past, their sails bright against the sky. Small boats ferried goods across rivers, soldiers stepping aboard with their muskets slung, crossing quietly from one shore to another. At night, the water grew dark, the moon reflected in ripples. Fires glowed faintly along the shore, and the sound of frogs and crickets mixed with the steady wash of waves. Here, the war was quieter still. The rivers and coasts became pathways, not of battles, but of movement. Supplies carried, men ferried, messages delivered. The water was a mirror, reflecting both the war and the stillness of the land it touched. And so, the sea and the shore remind us of the quieter side of the revolution. Not every soldier marched upon dusty roads. Not every battle was fought in fields. Some men lived their war upon the waves, keeping watch as the wind filled their sails, listening to the endless sound of water against wood. The ocean gave them space to reflect, to endure, and to dream of home. And perhaps, as you picture that harbour at dawn, or the long calm of the sea beneath the stars, you may feel the same stillness that they felt, a reminder that history is not only thunder and clash, but also silence, rhythm, and the endless patience of the tide. Chapter 9. The Women's Quiet War. When we speak of war, we often speak of soldiers, the men who marched, who drilled, who stood on battlefields. But there was another war, quieter, softer, and no less important. It was fought on farms, in kitchens, at spinning wheels and looms. It was a war of waiting, of tending, of making sure that when husbands, fathers and sons came home, if they came home, there was still a world waiting for them. This was the women's quiet war, life on the farm. Picture a small farm in the countryside. The fields lie wide under the pale light of dawn. Smoke curls from the chimney of a wooden house. A woman steps outside, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a pail in her hand. She walks to the hen house. The ground still damp with morning dew. The chickens stir, clucking softly as she scatters feed. A few eggs are gathered carefully, held close against her apron. In the barn, a cow lowing softly is milked, the sound of milk splashing steady into a tin pail. All these acts are quiet, steady, done without hurry. And yet, they keep the household alive, and by extension, they keep the army alive too. For what were the soldiers fed with, if not the grain, the flour, the dried meat sent from farms like these? Inside the house, another kind of work begins. The spinning wheel hums softly, its rhythm like a gentle heartbeat. Wool is spun into thread, thread into cloth. Shirts are patched, coats mended, socks darned, each stitch taken with care, not only to save what is worn, but to prepare for the men far away who will need warm clothing against the cold. Sometimes these women work together, neighbors gathering in one house to spin or sew, talking quietly as their hands moved. It was not loud work, but it was a labor of resolve. Every shirt made, every coat repaired, was a message. We have not forgotten you. Supplying the soldiers, food was gathered, stored and sent. Barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour, baskets of vegetables were packed and loaded onto carts bound for camps. Sometimes, women themselves followed the wagons, walking miles to deliver food, blankets, or even water to the men in camp. They did not march in ranks. They were not listed on rosters, but their presence was felt in every spoonful of soup, every bite of bread, every warm shirt worn by a soldier at dawn. And beyond all this, there was the work of simply keeping life going. The children still needed teaching. The fields still needed plowing. Fences had to be mended, livestock fed, grain ground, candles made. Each day, 1,000 small decisions kept the farm alive, so that the soldiers would still have a home to return to. This too was war, a war without drums or muskets, a war fought with care and patience, a war that asked women to be both mothers and fathers, farmers and protectors. All at once, there were lonely nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the house felt too empty. There were mornings when news arrived, of a skirmish far away, of neighbors lost, and still the work went on. The courage of these women was not measured by charges or victories, but by persistence. The persistence to rise each day, to care for what remained, to keep hope alive until the war ended. So let us picture it once more. The early light over the farmyard, chickens scattering as grain falls, a woman bent over her spinning wheel, the thread shining in the firelight, a table where bread is set to rise, destined for soldiers far from home, a quiet moment at dusk as she sits by the window, mending a coat by candlelight. This was the women's quiet war, a war fought not with muskets, but with needle and thread, not with cannons, but with care, not in a single battle, but in 100,000 ordinary days, where life was held together so that freedom might take root. And perhaps, as you picture those hands at work, you may feel the quiet strength that carried a nation through its hardest years, soft, steady, enduring. Chapter 10. Music, campfires, and daily sounds. When we think of war, we imagine noise, the thunder of cannons, the sharp crack of muskets, the rush of shouting men. But in truth, the greater sounds of the revolution were far quieter. They were the hum of camp life, the murmurs by firelight, the steady rhythm of chores and songs. It was these sounds that carried soldiers through their waiting, through their hunger, through their long nights of uncertainty. The music, the murmurs, the prayers, the laughter, together they gave shape to the stillness of war. Picture the heart of a winter camp. A circle of men around a fire. The flames flicker upward, sparks rising into the night air. Shadows stretch long across the snow, dancing on tents and huts. Around the fire, men sit quietly. One pokes at the logs with a stick. Another sips slowly from a tin cup. A few murmur to one another, voices soft, as though the fire itself were listening. The campfire was not just warmth, it was a hearth, a reminder of kitchens left behind, of families gathered at their own fires, far away. The crackle of logs became the sound of comfort. It meant food, it meant company, it meant survival. Now imagine the faint tune of a fiddle. Perhaps it is an old farm song, or a hymn remembered from childhood. The bow glides across the strings and the notes float softly into the night. Men listen without speaking. Some hum along, their voices low and rough. Others simply close their eyes and let the sound carry them away from hunger, from cold, from fear. Music was more than pastime. It was reminder of weddings, of dances, of summer nights when the war was still far away. And in that remembrance, men found a kind of strength. For a tune softly played could make the camp feel less like an army and more like home. Not all sound was music. Much of it was simply the hum of daily work. Axes struck wood, echoing through the forest. Shovels scraped against frozen ground. Hammers rang as nails were driven into the frames of huts. Even these sounds carried comfort, for they gave rhythm to the day. They broke the silence of waiting, turning time into work that could be measured, completed, shared. In the evening, boots scuffed against dirt paths as men carried buckets of water. Pots clattered gently as stew was stirred. The ordinary noises of living gave shape to extraordinary times. There were moments of lightness too. Laughter rose now and then, faint but real, as stories were told around the fire. One man recalled his farm and the stubborn mule that refused to plow. Another mimicked an officer's stern voice, drawing chuckles from the circle. Other times, voices lowered into murmured prayers, words carried softly into the night air. Half whispered, half sung, these small sounds mattered. They reminded the men of who they were and of what they still held on to. For in laughter, in prayer, in quiet talk, there was life, a life that endured even in the shadow of war. And then, as the fire burned low, the camp grew hushed. Men stretched out on the ground, cloaks pulled tight around their shoulders. Boots rested beside them, muskets leaned against posts. The last voices faded into silence, until only the crackle of the fire remained. Above, the stars wheeled silently, their cold light mingling with the orange glow below. And in that stillness, the camp seemed almost at peace. The revolution slept not in silence, but in the quiet music of camp life. The fire, the fiddle, the murmur, the laughter, the prayer. Together, they formed the rhythm of waiting. Not battle, not thunder, but the steady hum of endurance. Closing reflection. So let us picture it once more. The firelight glowing in the dark, sparks drifting upward. The fiddle bow sliding gently, its song carried on the wind. The rhythm of axes, the scrape of shovels, the clatter of pots, the rise of laughter, the whisper of prayers, and finally, the hush of sleep. The fire's last ember glowing in the night. This was the music of the revolution's stillness. Not loud, but enduring. Not heroic, but human. And perhaps, as you drift with these sounds, you may feel the quiet rhythm of their world, the hum of life in uncertain times, steady as a heartbeat, soft as a lullaby. Chapter 11. Southern Campaign. Life between the battles. When we think of the Southern Campaign of the American Revolution, we often picture the names of great battles: Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse. But between those battles lay long stretches of waiting. And it is there, in the quiet spaces where the war truly lived. Life did not stop for war. Fields still had to be tended, rivers still crossed, animals still cared for, meals still cooked. And so, we turn now to the southern colonies, to the plantations and small farms, to the swamps and rivers, to the slow-moving days that stretched between marshes and musket fire. Picture a wide field beneath the warm southern sun. Tall grass ripples in the breeze. A line of enslaved laborers or hired hands moves slowly between the rows, hose in hand, working under the watchful eye of the overseer. The war touched this place, yet work never stopped. Cotton still needed picking. Corn still needed planting. Animals still needed feeding. The land had its own rhythm, one that no musket shot could interrupt. For those who lived here, the revolution was not just a distant thunder. It was a shadow that passed across the fields, lingering but not halting the endless cycle of labor and survival. Not far away, soldiers made camp along a riverbank. Their tents were pitched in neat rows, the canvas bright under the midday light. Horses grazed at the edge of the water. Men washed their shirts in the current, laying them on bushes to dry. The river was not just water, it was life. It cooled weary feet, slaked thirst, and carried boats filled with food, powder, and news. At night, the frogs sang loudly, and fireflies drifted like tiny sparks through the dark. Here, the war moved at the pace of the river, slow, meandering, patient. Deeper still, in the Carolina swamps, partisans waited. Men crouched among the cypress knees, the air heavy with the smell of moss and mud. Sometimes they moved silently through the water, their reflections rippling as they crossed in the moonlight. Sometimes they simply waited, listening, watching, letting the stillness cover them like a blanket. The swamp was both shield and prison, hiding them from their enemies, but also trapping them in its endless wet silence. The sound of a single splash could carry for miles, and so they moved slowly, carefully, breathing in rhythm with the night. Inside the great houses, life took on its own stillness. Women sewed by the windows, mending torn coats or stitching new shirts for husbands and sons. The sound of a spinning wheel filled the hallways, steady and low. Meals were prepared with what was left: cornmeal, beans, whatever could be spared for the soldiers' cause. Letters were read and reread by candlelight, their paper worn soft from being held too long. The house was quieter now, with so many of its men gone to fight. Yet it remained the heart of the land, a place where news arrived, where plans were made, where hope was tended as carefully as the kitchen fire. The Southern Campaign was not quick. Armies marched for weeks across dusty roads, sometimes only to find the enemy gone. Skirmishes flared, then faded. A day of noise was followed by a month of quiet. For the men who fought and the families who waited, the war was not a single moment but a long season, stretching from one harvest to the next, one spring to another. And in that season, patience was forged like iron. Let us picture it once more. The fields under the southern sun, steady and endless. The riverbank lined with canvas tents, the water shining in the light. The dark swamp where shadows hid watchful men. The plantation house, quiet but alive with the work of waiting. And above it all, the slow arc of time, carrying the revolution through its southern chapter like the tide carrying a boat. This was the Southern Campaign, not only its battles, but its stillness. Not only its victories, but its long days of endurance. And in that stillness, the war was lived, breath by breath, step by step, until spring returned, and the road called once more. Chapter 12. The Final Winter and the Long Road to Peace. For the soldiers of the Revolution, The last winter of the war came not with thunder and drums, but with silence. Snow covered the fields. Fires burned low. Armies, both British and American, settled into stillness, waiting for news of peace that seemed always just beyond the horizon. And so, before muskets were laid down, there was another season of waiting. A final pause, a final winter. The fighting had slowed. After Yorktown in 1781, the Great Clash was over. Yet the war was not ended. Treaties had not been signed. Armies had not gone home. And so, men remained in their camps. In New York, in the Carolinas, in scattered posts across the colonies, they passed their days in quiet labor, chopping wood, repairing huts, boiling thin stews in blackened pots. The sound of axes echoed through the frozen air. Smoke curled from chimneys. Boots crunched across packed snow. Life had narrowed to its essentials: warmth, food, survival, and patience. The revolution, in its final chapter, was not loud but lingering. Morning came slowly. The soldiers rose from their blankets, breath white in the cold. Fires were coaxed back to life. Hard bread and weak coffee passed from hand to hand. The day stretched out with small tasks. Boots were mended. Shirts were patched. Muskets were cleaned, though no battle was near. Men drilled, though the urgency had faded. Their lines formed more slowly now, their movements less sharp. And in the afternoons there was quiet. Some wrote letters, some carved wood, some simply sat by the fire, gazing into the flames as if waiting for time itself to move forward. Letters carried the weight of this final winter. One soldier wrote to his wife, "The war seems over, yet we cannot yet go home. We wait. Each day is the same, and I dream of walking again through our door." Another wrote to his children, "I think of you in your fields of play. May this be the last season we are apart." The words were not dramatic. They were simple, ordinary, and yet, within them lay the longing of a nation, the hope that this war, so long endured, might finally yield to peace. Long patience of peace. Even as armies waited, so too did families. At home, women tended farms and hearths. Children grew taller while fathers remained away. Towns endured shortages, but life went on. Bread baked, candles lit, doors open to neighbors. Peace was close, but not yet here. And so the colonies waited, with the same patience as their soldiers, living one day at a time, one season at a time, until word arrived. And then slowly it came. A rider carrying word that negotiations were underway in Paris. A printed sheet declaring that Britain and America would soon agree to terms. The news spread slowly, from camp to town, from hearth to farm. And when, at last, it was confirmed, men folded their uniforms, slung muskets one final time, and began the long walk home. The revolution had ended not with a roar, but with a sigh, a long exhale of a people who had endured together, through silence and snow. So let us linger here in the hush of that final winter. The snow-covered huts, the steady crack of axes in the forest, the letters folded carefully, tucked into coats, the waiting, endless, patient, heavy with hope. This too was the revolution. Not just battles and victories, but years of stillness. The long road to peace was walked not only with muskets, but with patience, with fires that burned through the night, with hands that mended torn coats, with quiet dreams of spring. And perhaps, as you picture those final days, the snow falling softly, the smoke drifting upward into a pale sky, you may feel the stillness that carried a nation into peace. The revolution did not end in thunder, it ended in silence, and in that silence, a new world was born.